not from the world of academia. I'm actually a finance background, banker, finance, not a greedy banker, just a straightforward banker, finance, and have been in the business world all my life. Recently I just completed Green Mountain Capital, which is a small venture capital business here in Vermont, where we funded small and startups, software companies, high-tech, whatever, from Burlington down to Boston. Small businesses, we've helped 28 businesses get off the ground and get moving. Most of them quite successful. That's my kind of background, but all through my life I've had a very strong interest and commitment to the environment. It's something that you either have or you don't have, it seems to me, and a lot of people they just don't have it, including a lot of my friends. But fortunately, a lot of people do have it, and it's with you all your life, and can't let it go. You have to fight the fight. So here we are once more. I am at another event. I went to COP10, which is the Convention of Biodiversity, Conference of the Parties in Nagoya 2 years ago in Japan. It was a very disappointing event because I didn't think anything really was achieved there. And we're going to talk about COPs and climate and so on. I did suggest some a paper that some of you may have read in the materials that went out before this meeting, announcing the meeting. And one of these papers that I suggested you read if you have the time talks a little bit about this background, what REDD is all about, REDD, which we're going to come to in a minute, and the implications for tropical forests and climate change and so on. So if you did read that, then you will know a little bit more than perhaps those who did not read it. So I'm assuming here that most of you are not that conversant with REDD. Would that be correct? I mean, are there any REDD experts in the room who really know what REDD's all about? And, or are we sort of pretty well all on the same level and would like to learn something more about it? But it is a very important concept, and it's really worth spending a little time on if you're not familiar with it. So anyway, so what this slide is just really saying is it's expressing. There's a question mark there. There's a real dilemma that people feel today. There's a real quandary and there's real frustration, because even with the best of intentions, and with, as we'll see in a minute, with all the goings on, and Rio, just another example, Rio +20 coming up in next month in Rio, there have been hundreds, if not thousands, of meetings of well-intentioned people with millions and millions and millions of dollars of money being spent in this. And when you stand back and say, well, what progress have we made? What have we achieved on the climate change agenda? What have we achieved on the biodiversity agenda, tropical forests, whatever? And the answer is almost nothing. The populations continue to expand. People will utilize the Earth's resources more and more, less sustainably. And so we, so-called environmentalists, if you like, become increasingly concerned. We feel we're fighting a rearguard action. And part of the problems are that there is a perception that government's going to fund everything, and the problem is governments is they have limited funds. They only can spend the money that they get on the other side. Governments have their priorities, including poverty and poverty relief, etc., etc. And in many developing countries, the environmental budget is pretty low down on the totem pole compared to a lot of other priorities that they seem to be more important, and very often, of course, they are. So it's very difficult to find an answer. It just isn't easy. What I'm going to explain here in a few minutes is why it's important that we try to access the private sector more than we do, because the private sector has potentially unlimited funds. It's the marketplace. The markets come and go. The markets dip in and out of different activities and functions and products, etc. There's the stock market, or the money market, or the foreign exchange market, or the corn market, or the lumber market. There's a huge private sector, which is many, many, many times bigger than the government sector. So potentially, if the private sector is incentivized, and that's the key word, incentivized, if it's incentivized, the private sector could become a huge player in this whole environmental equation. And what I'm going to show you now is how we think that can happen. And although there are some initiatives afoot to try and make it happen, they've become so bound up in bureaucracy and scientific complexity, if you like, and so on, that very little is coming out the other end. And the net result is that climate change is not really happening, forests are not being protected, biodiversity is not being saved, and it's just about negatives almost wherever we look, and I'm sure you would agree with that, Taylor, it all looks very negative. So if I just continue now quickly, this is a kind of, give you some kind of framework within which I'm trying to address these issues. The United Nations Conventions on the Environment were formed in Rio de Janeiro. Actually, they were originally in Rio de Janeiro in 1992, which is second thing down. So there's the other summit took place in Rio 1992, and at that summit, which followed Stockholm 20 years earlier, so we've got here sort of sustainable development on the go. And in Rio, they created these three conventions: UNFCCC, which is the United Nations Convention on Climate Change, Biodiversity, and the Deserts and Desertification, and one or two others. So that essentially, the idea of these was to address man's overuse of the planet's resources. Climate change, greenhouse gases, etc., global warming, biodiversity, deserts, desertification, etc. And the whole point was to try and address these and come up with programs and funding, etc., that would address and curtail man's overuse of these various resources. And what we're going to talk about is coming down below that. One of the areas in common between the left-hand box here and this one is, well, there's an opportunity here, shall we say, because up to now, biodiversity has been funded purely by government donor dollars. It's very difficult to get the private sector involved in saving trees, or cut them down, but they save water. Difficult to get people to pay for water. Difficult to get people to pay for biodiversity. There's some going on, but it's very, very small. So here we had an opportunity because some people over here said, well, let's get the private sector involved with climate change. And so, because they created these carbon markets. The carbon was a value which was tradable. And they came up with some very ingenious mechanisms. This was all done in Europe. It wasn't done in America because Europe led the charge with this whole concept. And the EU, for the last 10, 15 years, has now been developing a very extensive, comprehensive carbon market, which essentially trades in various carbons and gases, etc. Insofar as tropical forests are important for biodiversity and important for climate change, as I'll show you in a second, because burning these forests at the rate they do creates a huge amount of CO2 going up into the atmosphere, and it's about there's just forests burning, being destroyed alone, it's about 15% of the total man-made emissions in the atmosphere. So it's a huge piece of it, and it's a piece that can be addressed relatively quickly compared to other alternatives such as developing nuclear or stopping coal or creating electric cars or whatever, which are some of the other alternatives to try and reduce man's emissions into the atmosphere. So if we go on, I just want to, so just here's the indication. The Earth Summit was 1992. Rio Plus 20 is going to happen next month. These are the UNFCCC COPs, Conference of the Parties. They've taken place every year. You see where they're taking place. One recent one was in Durban in South Africa. It took place just a few months ago. So every year they have these huge meetings where thousands of people attend, somewhere in the world, huge expense. And that's Azur's input there, the blah, blah, blah. He put that in, I didn't. But that's really what was happening. It's just another, for instance, the recent past we've had 3, Copenhagen, Cancun and Durban. where there was meant to be a huge amount of hype and progress and so on was meant to be made, but in fact, although some progress was made, at the end of the day, a lot of the agenda of these meetings was never realized, for all sorts of reasons, including political reasons, including the fact that there's major leadership coming out of America, which is the biggest potential partner of all. And because America doesn't take a lead in this area, the rest of the world tends to take a leaf out of America's book. So China and India, who are big emitters of gas and so on, sort of don't fall in line. So there are a lot of problems, but this gives you some indication of the huge amount of activity that's going on in the... Okay, so we're talking about, the agenda here is tropical forests. And I'm talking about BioREDD, which is just a word we're using to, it's a simple word that people can remember. The organization for the time being is called an Interim Mechanism to Protect Tropical Forests. Bit of a mouthful, difficult to remember, nobody can remember it. It's not a good name, but it's just a temporary name while we think of a better one. Meanwhile, we call it BioREDD because what it's trying to do is emulate what REDD's all about, which I'm going to show you in a minute what that is. But it has a sort of green aspect to it. It could be green red or could be BioREDD or whatever. But we're trying to take REDD, tropical forests as a whole, and then apply BioREDD to those areas that are more the conservation end of things as opposed to the industrial plantation end of things or whatever. So we're trying to focus more on the most important environmental agendas. So we're looking there at tropical forests, which are essentially in the tropics and have about 40–50% of the world's biodiversity is found in the tropical forests. So there's a huge environmental biodiversity value here, and because of the huge amount of emissions going up through destruction of tropical forests, there's a very strong climate agenda issue here. So you've got climate and biodiversity meeting in the same location, as I showed in the previous slide, and out of that is coming REDD, which I'm going to show you what it is in a minute. And I'm suggesting we need another one, a temporary one, interim one called BioREDD, which is going to get things done a little bit quicker, a little bit easier, and have the same effect, but much more quickly. So that's the agenda, and this is just an indication. This is Brazil, Amazon fires. So this is the sponge. This is the biggest sponge of CO2 on this earth. There's a huge climatic effect for the whole globe in the Amazon. And half the Amazon, or 40% of the Amazon, is being destroyed or degraded. And this is what's happening. This is why. There are bushfires everywhere. It not only creates a lot of smoke and CO2, etc., but of course it's also destroying forests. And this is part of the problem. To give you some indication of comparisons, if you look at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 large countries, the main emitters of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, create the greenhouse gas. If you look at the two biggest, these are USA energy and China energy. Those are the biggest contributors to greenhouse gases. CO2 equivalent there, with a combination of gases, which CO2 is the biggest. Then look at Indonesia, 2,563 out of forests. I mean, it's huge. It's not that much behind China with all its industry. So you just see how big a contribution Indonesia and Brazil, just those two countries, make to the overall emissions equation. It's absolutely huge. And so, looking at it big picture, yes, we can do something about energy in the USA. China, it's difficult. China's probably installing a coal-fired plant every week or so. I mean, it's expanding, it's growing, it's developing. And so that number's probably going to grow in China. Maybe they can stabilize it in the USA. But in fact, it's got to come down. But that's just to give you some sort of comparison of how important these, what a big factor these emissions are in the forest side.
These are annual numbers, right, per year?
These are annual numbers, yes, per year. Now, I will check that to make sure that I'm correct, but I believe that is correct. And I agree, it's not very clear, but it does say MTCO2E, and I'm sure it's annual table.
Okay.
I'll check that. And then, just to give you some idea, if you look at the 3 countries with the largest pieces of tropical forest, Brazil and this is not forest in the north, so we're not talking about forests in northern Europe and northern Asia. These are the tropical forests, because these are the ones that create so much weight of emissions. And you can go, if you go right to the right-hand side of this, you're seeing that annually Brazil 0.52%, so that's 0.5% of the forest is going every year, annually. And in Indonesia, where they have these huge palm oil plantation problems, because that's been a huge growth area over there, it's been 1.61% over there. And here in the Congo, what's happening there is that, as the asterisk shows, this 0.38 is almost 6%, about 6%, 0.6% now. Just in the last 5 years, the Congo, which was relatively unscathed before, is suffering far more deforestation, because as the palm oil companies are being chucked out of Indonesia, and they're not allowed to get into Brazil, so they're going to the Congo, where the rule of law is less sophisticated, and where there are more opportunities to do deals behind the scenes with government officials and so on, so it would seem. So you've got a real problem here, because after Brazil, the Congo Basin is the 2nd biggest tropical forest piece of real estate in the world. And these are not only the destruction of the forest creating emissions, but also you're reducing the size of the sponge, which is absorbing, sequestering the gases. Okay, so what is REDD? Like, we're now going to talk a bit about REDD. REDD stands for Reduced Emissions from Deforestation and Forest Degradation in Developing Countries. So this is a mechanism which is being developed by the UNFCCC, United Nations Climate Change Convention, with many other people who are involved, countries, etc., to figure out a way to essentially get developed countries to fund the restriction, the reduction of emissions from tropical forests in developing countries. There's one way of transferring value from developed to developing. And the idea being that if as I'll show you just now, if a company, a large energy company in the USA, for instance, cannot meet its obligations, or Europe cannot meet its obligations, they can offset some of that with saving emissions in another country, such as tropical forests. Or it could be alternative energy. Alternative, what's called native energy, which is a little company here in Vermont, does this with Indian reservations in Central America. They will install alternative energy plants to substitute for the grid, the coal, whatever it might be, and that saving of emissions is calculated, and Manger or somebody will buy those credits in order to be able to offset its footprint against carbon footprint again. So there's an example right here at home. This is just a much bigger picture one, and it's further away and more complex, because it's more difficult to count trees in the Congo than it is to figure out how many credits you're saving in Central America somewhere. So REDD Plus, which is just an extension of REDD, expands the definition before to include forest conservation, sustainable forest management, enhancement of forest carbon stock. So it's a more comprehensive, holistic concept. It's meant to take a much more emphasis on protecting the environment, not just preventing it being burnt down, but for managing it with the communities, etc. It's a more comprehensive definition. So REDD was the big promises, and for the last 5-10 years, REDD has been the main item on the sort of climate, well, a major item on the climate change agenda, a very big item on the conservation agenda, because it addresses tropical forests, which is of high concern to everybody. As I said, 15% of total man-made CO2 emissions emanate from burning forests. And REDD was seen as the solution for stopping deforestation. It was never ratified, it has become too far complicated, time-consuming and costly to administer. So they've been Copenhagen, Cancun, Durban, the last 3 COPs. REDD's been right up there on the agenda. Each time they come away with, they haven't got, the mechanism hasn't been confirmed, it hasn't been finally defined, it hasn't been agreed upon. So there are too many issues, too many disagreements. So REDD is now becoming a huge promise unfulfilled. And one of the issues of REDD is that to put it in place, there have got to be countries like the Congo or Peru or Ecuador, Brazil, that have a mechanism in place politically so they can actually manage the REDD process, because it is complicated. And there are a lot of issues about land tenure and financial mechanisms and all sorts of things which have to be in place. And Brazil's done that because it's ahead of the game. And many other developing countries, places like the Congo and so on, and other African countries, are way behind. So there's a need for a lot of capacity building to go on at the government level before there's a mechanism in place to be able to address more complex transactions, etc. So net result is, although a lot of money is being spent on sort of capacity building at government levels in countries, very little is happening on the ground. Very few projects are being funded, and that's a real problem. So why we shouldn't rely on REDD Plus in the short term? Well, these are just sort of some of the points summarized that I've just been explaining to you. So there's a lot of things hanging out in the air there, and no doubt this will be debated again in Rio. Hopefully there's going to be more progress in Rio. Meanwhile, there is a huge amount of money going on. There are many, many meetings that a lot of people are concerned about. There's a huge frustration, and it just isn't happening. And the other thing about REDD is that it tends to address deforestation, and the higher deforestation has been historically, the more opportunity there is to save future emissions from contiguous forests, etc. And if the deforestation has been fairly low, such as in faraway areas or protected areas or whatever, it's the room for finding large savings potential reduces, which makes private protected areas less attractive from a sort of REDD point of view, because there's less profit in it, if you like, or you get a lesser price. So there's a trade-off there which is quite complicated, we won't go to it now, but what we would like to see is REDD become more responsive to the protected area needs as opposed to areas that have been highly degraded and destroyed. So here's the carbon cycle, just to give you some idea. You have the burning of forests happening on the left-hand side, CO2 going up into the atmosphere. There's an automatic, there's a cycle that takes place, and the forests draw down the carbon and store the carbon. And then normally, where there's less burning, this stuff is staying with the forest and in the ground and in the sea where carbon is stored. And the Earth has somehow managed to cope with all this over the years. What is happening is that man-made emissions in the last century or so have really increased this carbon flow. And so the pluses and minuses are starting to get sort of bent out of recognition, and the parts per mil of CO2 in the atmosphere are increasing. And they're increasing to the extent that we are going to get this global warming is becoming a reality. And you need to sort of look up any article on global warming, and you'll find it'll describe why this is not a good thing and why global warming is something that's going to really impact on sea levels and biodiversity and also people's livelihoods and so on. So this is essentially what happens. So to try and explain how REDD works, here's a standing forest, and it's being well maintained. So it stores high amounts of carbon. It's also protecting ecosystem services and biodiversity, watersheds, etc. And the result is carbon is stored, emissions prevented, healthy ecosystems, and communities, of course, living in many of these forests. Right. So here you have some degradation going on, the forest being destroyed are over to the right-hand side of the picture. So there's a plan to grant a concession to cut part of this forest. Results: CO2 emitted, carbon storage reduce, ecosystem decline, no long-term benefits. So this is a problem not only from a local point of view, communities, but also from a biodiversity point of view and from a climate point of view, because this CO2 is going upward. So how does REDD help the situation? Well, what REDD says is, okay, if we put money in to prevent that destruction that was going on there, if we invest money in conservation programs to prevent that happening, we've saved that amount of CO2. The CO2 has not gone up. And so that has a value, and depending on the markets and so on. And so what REDD does is to calculate this and find markets which will essentially trade, buy this, pay for it. So this is how money is found. It can come from donor, governments can donate money to this. The governments have a very limited funds. So the answer is they don't donate, they don't give very much. Potentially, there's a huge amount of money in the marketplace which essentially converts this financial opportunity, if you like, into a market which can be bought and sold by investors. So this is how it works. For instance, if you're looking at a factory in Europe or America, and they have they have a cap of 1,000 tons. They have to save 1,000 tons of emissions in terms of government decree, in terms of the climate change agenda. So this is what's happening now. Of course, energy companies in America are being made to reduce their carbon emissions. And they can only save 800, they can't save the full 1,000. So they are taking 200 of the tons of emissions, and they're going across to the forest on the right there. And they're spending a 200 and buying credits that have been developed out of the forest by saving the forest programs there. So they're paying for those forest programs on the right. And what's happening is that overall 800 plus 200 emissions worth are being saved in terms of value up there. So the global climate agenda benefits to the tune of 1,000 tons of CO2 saved, 800 over there, and 200 there through this REDD mechanism. So that's a very sort of basic idea. It's obviously much more complicated than that. That's why it's got bogged down in a lot of bureaucracy and so on. But that's basically a good idea. I mean, it works. It's a wonderful idea. And that's what we're trying to work on. Is how can we speed this process up? Because it's clearly got bogged down in a huge amount of, as we saw, all those meetings and so on, and that's what happened. REDD plus benefits. Well, you've got the climate benefits. Climate change mitigation, reduction of climate change, healthy weather in our communities, schools, education, there's a whole bunch of water. And then over here, you've got community benefits, ecosystem services, water, food, new opportunities, community development, etc. And of course, there's the biodiversity development there. So there's a whole slew of the benefits, and they haven't said they don't include sequestration. Sequestration of CO2, of course, is a huge benefit, which should be under here, I suppose. But that's just to give you some idea of. And there's far more benefit to saving tropical forest emissions than any other emission. I mean, if you stop smoking out of the smokestack, you just stop smoking out of the smokestack. You obviously cleaner air. Here, you don't only get cleaner air, but you're also doing all these other things as well. So there's like a sort of double, triple, or quadruple bottom line for REDD as a concept, as a mechanism, compared to other emission savings devices. Which is why it's such an odd thing that the world hasn't figured out a way to make REDD happen, because it's so much more valuable per ton saved, with so-called co-benefits. We think that the developing world, the governments and the development banks and whoever, would have figured out, hey guys, this is a no-brainer. This is the low-hanging fruit. And so what we're saying is, why the hell haven't you gone on with this faster? Why haven't you made this thing happen? It's not impossible. It's by no means impossible. perfectly straightforward, not straightforward, but it's perfectly doable in terms of what other things have done, like getting to the moon and doing all the other things that we've managed to do. This is perfectly doable with what you might call a reasonable society. And REDD, this is not rocket science, and that's a huge political problem. So it's done through this sort of mechanism up here, carbon credits purchased from, that's into the marketplace. So the marketplace is when the money goes across to the forest, creates the carbon credits. Carbon credits then have to be sold off, paid, and so somebody has to buy them, and that happens through the marketplace. And the marketplace is this is just for forest carbon markets, and the reported total here is $432 million over a 4 or 5 year period since the markets began in about 5 or 6 years ago. And so you'll see that this is the extent, and there are voluntary markets, which mean they're not regulated by governments. These are the marketplace just set up on its own. There are kind of people just want to buy and sell. Manger wants to utilize its carbon footprint, so it goes through native energy on a voluntary market and buys and sells some credits. And so you've got a voluntary market. Then you've got this is the EU. A little bit of forestry going in there, but they do very. The problem with the formal markets is the formal markets is that they'll deal with carbon emissions from smokestacks, from coal, from energy, etc. But they won't. The formal markets do not deal with forest carbon because they find it too complicated. They can't figure out the rules. It's still arguing about how do you count the trees and so on. How much carbon is there stored in these forests? So as you'll see in a minute, this $432 million, it's something from an environmental perspective. It's quite a lot of money, but the overall scheme of things is actually quite small.
What is the primary and secondary market?
The primary market is the transaction which takes place up there between the product producers, makers, the people who run the project. Could be a large NGO like World Wildlife Fund or Nature Conservancy or whatever in there, creating the carbon credit, going to the marketplace. That's the primary transaction. Secondary transactions are where people come in and buy and sell credits, so some market traders as opposed to investors, really. And it's pretty small here. It's pretty undeveloped. So that's just an indication. Don't worry about the numbers. This is the dark red is red. What that illustrates is how new it is and how small it is. But at the first sign of something happening, when Mr. Obama got up and said that we're going to have cap and trade in the USA, boom. There was an immediate reaction in the marketplace. So my point is, if you incentivize the private sector, it will react very, very quickly. The market is right up here. It's right up through above the building. It's huge, potentially. And we're talking about trillions of dollars. We're talking about an awful lot of money. If they really get their acts together and really figure out ways to incentivize this through forest bonds, through the World Bank getting involved, through governments getting involved, because they decide to do it, because it's so important. So this is just an indication of how quickly this thing can move. And here are the total carbon markets, and you'll see here a figure of 141 billion, which is 142 billion. And just before we saw the forest, the forest carbon piece was 432 million, 0.3%. The point of this slide is to say, okay, if emissions coming out of tropical forests is 15% of the total man-made emissions, why? How come we only get 0.3%? So there appears to be some opportunity missed out here. And in fact, McKinsey and others have done charts to show, in terms of ease of operation, comparing all the emission alternatives, emission control alternatives available to man, i.e. what causes emissions, and how can we address bringing them down? Nuclear will take 50 years. Motor cars, so there's a graph. And some of the easier opportunities, quicker, perhaps even cheaper opportunities, depending on how you calculate the opportunity cost of some of these activities, but is in the forest sector. So that 0.3% to be on the line of ease of operation, etc., could be 40% to 45% in terms of actions that could be taken over the next 10, 15 years to mitigate carbon emissions, to bring the emissions down. So it's a tiny figure.
Sorry, I need to ask the primary secondary question again.
Yes.
So primary CDM and secondary CDM?
Yes, so primary
Secondary is 10 times bigger.
Excuse me, what 10 times?
Secondary is 10 times bigger in 2010.
Yes, now what happens in CDM is so let's look at, so you're looking at CDM there.
Just looking for 2010.
Up there, yes. So what's happened is CDM is part of EU ETS.
Okay.
And it's a very, very complicated mechanism. It has hardly any forest projects at all in CDM because they're so complicated. Pico Bonito in Guatemala, Honduras is a little project up there. They were, I think, the first to get CDM. And Robert Lapides, who I've spoken to several times, said, Michael, I almost gave up. It was so complicated, it was so difficult. So there is some market called AR, but most of CDM was alternative energy to China.
Okay.
Yeah, like 3/4 of it. And there turned out to be a huge amount of fraud, a huge amount of double counting, and so the CDM market sort of semi-collapsed out of just pure people's warehouse. It's China really a developing country.
And what's the secondary part?
Secondary part is the trading.
Of those credits once they've been awarded,
Yes,
buying
yeah.
so much credit.
So because it's a regulated market, the trading is much stronger and they're much more active than the voluntary markets where the trading is.
So those don't add up to volume of carbon, right? Because the secondary market is trading the same ton of carbon maybe 5-6 times.
Yes, there are some estimates in here, and they tell you that in the report. It's actually,
That's the same ton of carbon being sold several times.
Right, right. And there are a couple of right, and there are 2 or 3 reports. The World Bank produces statement trends of the carbon market, and that comes from that World Bank. So this is available. There's 2010. I think 2011 is just coming out now. So that would be that one, and then Ecosystems Marketplace, which is part of the Forest Trends Group, which is an amazingly good contributor to this whole subject matter, have State of the Forest Carbon Markets, an annual report, and Building Bridges State of the Voluntary Carbon Markets, so some of these numbers come out of these. And it's worth reading this stuff because if you're interested in the subject, because it really does give a lot of good background material and so on, and an indication of some of the trends.
Yeah.
They are on the voluntary markets. They're even those are written just recently. They are very positive on the voluntary markets, despite the political problems notwithstanding.
Yeah, what got me excited 3 years ago when I saw this graph was like, wow, if I could increase that 0.3% to 5% with alternative financial mechanisms where instead of having tier 3 data to corroborate all the carbon that's out there, I could just have something on a photo that I'm like, hey, I don't know, it's around 100 tons, and open up that spigot to 5%. We're talking about $2 billion instead of $400 million to work on our stuff. So that's where the game is at.
Well, the private sector is going to be incentivized. They're not going to invest. They're not going to invest your father's pension into the Congo trees because it's just too risky. They invest in IBM or Microsoft or Facebook. But the fact is that there are ways to make it attractive. So you give them a really good story. You're saving tropical forests. You're saving global warming. You're doing this. You're getting involved with communities, etc., etc., etc. And you've got a tradable instrument, which you're getting at a good price. So prices will be discounted because of risks and so on. So there are all these bits built in and still able to come up with a transaction that will be very attractive to people who have any interest in the environment. You can tell our customers we're saving, we're doing always good things, and you can get the story out there, which becomes very appealing from a marketing point of view. You just have a look at countries in Vermont. So that's that. So we're just saying red plus is a promise unfulfilled. That's what we're saying, and it's clear. Because so now I'm just going to give a couple of sort of examples that we worked on. When we had this workshop in Costa Rica that Azio referred to, we took a couple of areas to sort of demonstrate. So this is the DRC, Congo. From there to there, it's about 400 miles. So the red area is about 10 million hectares.
Twice the size of Costa Rica.
Quite a big chunk of real estate, okay? And there's nothing happening there. There's a bit of degradation going on, there's some agriculture, there's some development and so on. There are quite a lot of concessions. CI is Conservation International. Well, what I find is down here at Salonga, which is a big area over here, which is huge, to protected areas. Also WWF is over here as well, in this area. African Wildlife Foundation is over here, and so on. So there are a lot of people all over the place, but there's nothing happening. There's no money being spent on the ground. This is bonobo habitat. Bonobo only lives south of the Congo River. They can't swim. So north of the Congo River they have chimpanzees, south of the Congo River they have bonobos. Very close but different, different species. Bonobo is closest primate to man. So we are looking here at a concept where through REDD you would essentially introduce REDD program into these areas here. There's actually already some CDM going on here. This area was set aside by the government of DRC, Sankuru, 3 million hectares, specifically to be funded by REDD. 5 years ago, not a penny's gone in there yet. It's impossible to find the money. The Development Conservation Initiative, which have agreements with all the tribes up here. Local NGOs are set up, like AgriPric, for instance, and so on. There's a real good relationship between the NGO and the local NGOs, and the local governments, and the local communities. They have some 200 agreements with 200 different tribes in this whole area. And it's a huge climate change agenda, it's a huge environmental agenda, it's a huge community development agenda. There's no money. Money's going to studies, money's going to plans back here, Kinshasa, capital, and now it's happening on the ground over here. I mean, Ted Turner is being phoned around right now to see if he can't get him to put some money into this. And this is what it's getting down to, because people are so desperate to try and find ways. And then in the middle here you have your biodiversity corridors, so-called. The idea would be to try and link these up through some CDM money perhaps, or some other four forms of funding, sustainable agriculture, etc. So there are people living in these areas, of course. But this is just one concept that we discussed in some detail.
What were you going to say?
Oh no, first I just wanted to just clarify, so the green and the yellow are already being managed by some type of organization, and the red is what you're looking to have a corridor?
Not managed, they have been identified as being, so for instance CI here, Conservation International, is working with Bonobo, with these people here, to develop some CDM funding and or REDD funding in these areas, like Coconut-Marie and the concessions. The Vie Sauvage is the local NGO, which is on the spot, has offices on the spot, and so on.
All the required memorandums of understanding and partnership agreements and like sub-regional and local-based community groups that work within that REDD polygon are already lined up and waiting for the market to come in. Well, not just waiting, we're actively also pursuing to find those mechanisms. The thing is, when you look at the traditional requirements from the UNFCCC or the REDD+ type projects, this doesn't fit that mold, because there's some aspects of getting REDD funding are as ridiculous as having like a statewide policy change, or having like a complete understanding of like land tenure rights, where people here 30% might have with 0 land titles, because it's a different structure. However, we do have already, through the multiple partnerships that are here, the credibility for this to move forward.
So when you say, there's no money, what you're trying to do is get money to buy the land, because you have people ready to help you.
Not to buy the land, get money to
help manage,
help the people manage their own resources. sustainably, with education, with there are some conservation measures put in place,
Okay.
alternative agriculture, whether we're encroaching on the forest, alternative sources of timber, etc.
The social
So
and
try to
envi-
address
yeah.
the drivers of destruction, degradation in these various areas. In some cases, the logging concessions. Over here, for instance, Laktumba, to the west of these areas here, there's some REDD projects just been approved there. Wildlife Works and ERA from Canada, and a joint venture over here. These are highly degraded areas. So they're addressing those because there's more apparent profit in that. That's okay, but we're saying, wait a minute guys, but here's this huge area here, where the people are on side, they've signed up, they want to protect the bonobo. You protect the bonobo, you protect everything else, you protect the forest. The two go together.
But the social and environmental character of this region is not par with the requirements of the international donors. It's like a round hole in a square peg.
And
That's
we
the whole
believe that it's much cheaper to manage protected areas which have relatively little degradation in them than these highly degraded areas where restoring already degraded land is very expensive. So you need much more money.
I gotta say, I mean, you're glossing over a lot of the really
Yeah,
sensible
yes,
reasons
yes.
for why that's true, right?
What's true?
Most of the things you've been saying. So why money is pouring into Laktumba
Yes.
and not the less risky places, it's because
One
this
reason.
money is, I just want to posit one, which is pretty well known. That REDD is about reducing likely emissions by changing something that would prevent what would have been emitted anyway. And when risks are really low in the middle of nowhere,
Yes.
the likelihood of it changing, given $0, is pretty low. So adding dollars doesn't change the outcome. And so I think that's pretty sensible for people who are interested in slowing climate change. If what you want primarily is carbon to stay where it is as opposed to being emitted, you would be crazy to spend your money someplace where carbon's at no risk of going up in the atmosphere. You'd be smart to spend your money where it's at high risk, and that's why REDD is written the way it is.
Right.
It's why more projects are around Laktumba than they are
Right.
out way to the east. And so people aren't being idiots. They're really focused on solving the climate problem through forests. And I think we need to be careful that I would love to capture 5% of that capital flow for conservation. But let's be honest, it's a bad investment for climate change.
Well,
It's the worst investment in terms of reducing near-term emissions, which was the point.
all this is threatened. The logging concessions all around here.
And what
Okay.
makes
And,
this so much
and they're
less?
moving in. And they're moving, so even though these areas haven't suffered high degradation like they have over here,
Yeah.
it's next on the list.
Right.
The Chinese are moving in, and so
But you can be smarter than that. I mean, you can model likelihood of deforestation. People do it very sensibly, and it'll be 10 times as high in Laktumba as it is here, just because it's closer to roads and markets. And so I just think we have to be at least acknowledging
Yes.
the real reasons that a dollar invested in reducing deforestation has a higher chance of reducing emissions in a place where there's risk of deforestation.
There is the other side of the coin, I believe, and I would argue, and that is that where you have the higher degradation and therefore the higher perceived REDD value, which is what we're discussing, that's where the palm oil guys are going to go in. And that's more profitable.
Right, so the opportunity cost.
So the
of looking
opportunity
for-
cost for REDD proper
Yeah.
is much higher.
But that's an empirical question, right?
Well,
You
I
can
think it's
calculate
all-
both sides and
Yes.
decide.
Yeah, I think, but it's a very interesting one because
Yeah.
that strikes the argument saying the opportunity cost of protecting that is far less.
Yeah.
So if you say, if I'm in Rio 20 and I've got my United Nations hat on, I say, well, how do we get to some of these areas that are not already being destroyed? How do we make sure that they stay the way they are?
Yeah.
So looking at a CBD agenda as opposed to so how can we get something made into CBD so we can get the stuff with CBD stamp of approval,
Yeah.
saying yes, we approve these products. They're kosher, they're good, and they're cheaper to accomplish.
Yep. They'll achieve less emissions reductions.
Yes.
So
Yes.
it'll be cheaper,
Yeah,
but
cheaper.
you'll get less
Yeah.
too,
Yeah.
what you want is carbon.
That's my
And so that's, I mean, we've talked about this before, you can
Yeah.
scale it by
yeah.
deforestation risk, so it costs less money to secure ton of carbon, but you're less likely to have made a difference.
But if you take a 25-year scenario, that'll be gone in 25 years. You see, what we're doing, we're not saying this is gone now, but this is going to be gone in 25 years. So you take a 25-year scenario, and this is the threat.
Yeah.
So you project it forward, and you get a lower price, and there'll be a lower price, there'll be a bigger discount in the markets. Because it is lower price, lower value. So no, it's a very interesting, it's a very good point, and it's an interesting one. I think there is a way to come to a solution.
Yeah. If you want to link it to carbon reductions of emissions, you're going to have to acknowledge the economics of that.
Yes.
We're not trying to launder money for conservation.
So this is why I'm here at the Good Institute. This is a good economic environmental
It is.
question, I think. And I think it's very important, I suggest. So I'm hoping I'm in the right place to sort of try and develop this concept. Hopefully with the world we're going to sort of, hey, this could be well rich to pursue with others. Okay. So then, another project, which is Azure could talk about, we met in Costa Rica down just at the bottom right there. Ecoticus is a project that Azure worked on for a few years. This is the Mesoamerica Biodiversity Corridor. So the red is the are the protected areas, right?
Yeah, they're all, it's a similar scenarios as the one in Africa. But the point of this slide is not just going into the details here, it's more like the African bonobo case, there's 15, 20 different areas in the world that we could actually, the Carpathians where what's his name, Bill Keaton. Yeah, Keaton is interested in doing something. I mean, with this kind of model, we could find locally, sub-regional, connectivity-based initiatives that could fit this model as the conversation moves forward. Yes, in Costa Rica, we've been talking about Mesoamerican biological corridor for a long time. And it's been called Paseo Pantera, it's been called different incarnations. And there's also an opportunity to do it at a very local level, like we've done in the Osa Peninsula. So I posit that the model could be both scalable and replicable.
Okay, we're running out of time, so we need solutions now. So I suggest we need a mechanism, so hence this interim mechanism. Protected areas of biodiversity corridors, as we've discussed. Public-private hybrids, so the idea is the seed money would go in from governments. It's happening already. Some governments are putting money through LifeWeb, a facility in conservation in CBD, the head office in Montreal. The money is being channeled through to projects in developing countries. Germany is a big contributor to that. Norway is putting money straight into the hands of NGOs in Tanzania, for instance, where there are 10 or 12 pilot projects with several large NGOs, international NGOs involved with that, money coming direct from Norway to fund these. And then what has to happen, once the projects are set up and operating, then they've got to develop these credits and sell them out to the marketplace, because Norway will not go on funding the project in 25 years. So the idea is that you set the projects up with government money, and then the private sector comes in when it's being set up. That really reduces the risk for the private sector. So it would be a public-private REDD type mechanism, tropical forest focus, protected areas. We respect sovereignty, land tenure, other carbon rights, etc. So this would not be a land grab as perceived in many articles among reads and so on. There would be a very, very strong emphasis on working with the communities, as Azure has done in Costa Rica, as the Bonobo people do in the Con. So there would be a very, very strong emphasis on that. If it's not land tenure in terms of ownership, it certainly would be land tenure in terms of settlement rights, carbon rights, etc., as they do, for instance, in Namibia and other countries. But only 1% of land in Africa is privately held, so it's a very big issue. So one has to finesse that in a sensible and intelligent way, but there are ways to do it. So we're looking for a policy mandate for BioREDD. And as I was going to Rio plus 20, he wants us to get on the agenda there.
Right.
Bring it home, Azure.
Not in Rio, but after.
Okay, so there we go. Anybody wants to ask questions or want to sort of spend more time on it, I'm happy to stay on and just answer anything or go through it.
Well, we've taken an hour of your time and of Michael's. we can have a couple of questions, comments, and then we'll stay for a while. We can have a chat after that as well.
It's a very complicated subject to try and sort of put out in a few minutes. I was given 20 minutes to explain it. And that's lost over.
I guess my concern is one of political. Just if the U.S. is the one who's, you know, the big holdup, there needs to be some like better thought about when are we going to have these large meetings around the U.S. political system. I don't think anything's going to happen 6 months prior to an election with a Democratic candidate who doesn't want to seem too environmental and lose the election. I mean, we've almost set ourselves up to failure within the structure of the U.S. political system.
I quite disagree with you, and the view we take is that politics notwithstanding and the position of the US notwithstanding, you either believe climate change is going to happen or it's happening or you don't. And if you don't, well of course then maybe there's something else. But if you believe it is happening and there's going to be a lot of indications that it is for real, then sooner or later somebody's going to say, wait a minute, there's something going wrong here. There's sort of a bit of Florida suddenly going underwater or something or whatever. Things start to happen that are serious. And I'm suggesting that we don't wait for that to happen. We get moving, and the voluntary markets are telling us that there are a lot of people out there who are concerned about this, who want to invest in this because they realize it's an important thing to do. If there's no voluntary market, then there would really be no point having a discussion because then we're just looking for handouts from governments. But the voluntary market has shown that it really does, it's there, it's been there, it's robust potentially, it just needs to be incentivized. So if governments decide to incentivize it, we can get a huge amount of money from this. And that won't happen in the next 6 months. But meantime, we can at least get going on some pilots, and we can start funding some stuff on the ground. And in a year's time or 2 years' time, when they do decide to get cracking, well, we're very ready because we're going to get money will pour in then, I believe.
In the current scenario in the United States right now, with like California, for example, there's an opportunity there to work at a local level too, with like different agencies and councils that work directly with ecosystem services such as water. So if you take there's about 10,000 water councils in the United States that have a direct link to carbon markets. So in there, with a good conversation with the Government Accounting Standards Board, which is the entity that regulates the way that we do accounting at the city level, you can craft a solid argument that goes in there and says, when you do your next balance sheet, you can now, instead of just having this green karma accounting section on your spreadsheet, you can actually have a value transfer or any type of valuation scenario to put in your inventory of assets, your green capital. And in the context of current conversations in California and in Washington State, where we work with the Earth Economics hat, that is happening right now. So there's small local opportunities to like carry this conversation. It's no longer about whether carbon sequestration is an ecosystem service that's worth something or not. It's no longer about whether there's a price associated or a market for it. It's more on finessing the financial mechanisms to make that into mainstream accounting. That's exactly what we're doing.
When I got money for the World Wilderness Congress, which took place in Colorado in 1987, I was doing the rounds of Washington looking for funds to fund this Congress back in 1984. And the World Wildlife Fund was about the only NGO in town which was concerned with international conservation. And there were Michael Wright and one or two others, and there were one or two other NGOs involved as well. They were just the World Bank Environmental Department was 2 or 3 people and so on. It was tiny. And I thought to myself, we're never going to be able to save the world's environment through donations, through handouts. And so I got involved with the World Wilderness Congress, and I made a proposal because I'm a banker, I made a proposal for a World Conservation Bank, which would be private sector, public sector, joint venture, hybrid like this. And it would do things like debt for nature swaps. We had all this debt, all these invested debt in the bank that I was then involved with. It was worth 10 cents on the dollar. So buy out this debt at 10 cents, in exchange for which get countries to promise to set aside land and serve it. When I went to Washington to essentially put this thing together, the United Nations liked the idea. They put $1 million on the table to fund a 2-year project, WRI, where I worked full-time for not a single NGO in Washington agreed with us that there was any potential money out there. They said, look, there's no money for this, you'll never find money. This is not going to happen. And not a single NGO was prepared to register to come on site, so I was on my own with WRI and etc. And then after 2 years I left, and several years later, the GEF, the Global Environmental Facility, was created out of this, and out to the World Bank. And it's $25 billion later. I'm not taking any credit for it. What I'm trying to say is that the concept that then was, there isn't the money for it. There's huge amounts of money in the system. It's just a question of how you get it. It's the mechanism that's important. The mechanism, REDD is a mechanism, and the problem is that the United Nations have failed to create and develop the mechanism in a way that can be utilized. They've been arguing about this and that, bits and pieces. Even now, they can't even define it. They can't even define forest.
On that note, I want to thank Michael for his time and coming forward.